Hey everyone, it's Sarah again with another video. This time I am going to be going through how I actually sun dry my tomatoes. So behind me are the tomatoes that I'm going to be using, the yellow pear tomatoes right here, and then if I have enough space I'm going to start going into some of these. So let's just get started. So the first thing is setting your oven to 200 degrees. And then, forgive me, the inside of my oven's just a little dirty on the mat. And then making sure that you have your rack separated. I don't put it all the way down on the bottom. I put it up one and then I skip two and put another one up just so that there's enough room. And then I line my baking sheets with parchment paper. You can use any type of parchment paper. I use the Reynolds Wrap 1. And then what I do is I just go and I take my tomato and I slice it in half like this, and then I stick it down like that. So I'm just going to go through and fill these trays up. So if you get any tomatoes that have any bad spots, like that top is pretty soft, then just make sure you cut those little bad spots off, because the rest of the tomato is still fine. Just those little bad spots I wouldn't keep on there. And when you're doing this, you're going to want to make sure that you're keeping the tomatoes as uniform as possible. That way they dry more evenly, but obviously there are going to be some that are a little bit bigger than others. So whenever you're going through this drying process, you'll just have to periodically check on all of the tomatoes so that you can remove the ones that are all the way done. Not all of them are going to dry at the same rate. Some of them will, some of them won't. So it's safe to say that you should, once it gets to that certain point, like after a couple of hours, which I'll tell you guys how long I go before I start checking on them. Once you meet that threshold, then you're going to want to periodically check on your tomatoes and take them out as they are drying up. I didn't even notice this, but these two yellow pear tomatoes are connected. I don't even know how that happened, but they grew together. Okay, so those are my 3 sheets of yellow pear tomatoes. I have about half of the second container left. I'm just going to put those in the fridge, and I'm going to put these in the fridge as well. So I'm going to go ahead and salt these really quick. And what I typically do is I just lightly salt them. That way it helps get the juices out. So I'll do a light salt on this side, and I typically just hold my grinder up really high just to get a nice little dusting of salt on them. And then I'm going to go ahead and stick these in the oven. Again, these are going to be stuck in an oven at 200 degrees. And I'm going to stick the 2 small ones side by side on the bottom rack. And then I'm going to stick the large one by itself on the top rack. And I'm actually going to set a timer for about an hour and a half. And at an hour and a half, I'm going to actually flip them over, lightly salt the other side, because, oh my goodness, because you don't want to over salt, and I barely salted these. So I'm going to flip them over. There we go. I'll flip them over after an hour and a half, lightly salt them like I did before, and I'll show you guys whenever I do that. And then depending upon where they're at in the drying process, I will determine how much longer they need to go. So it has been an hour and a half since I've put these tomatoes in, and it doesn't look like they're good enough to turn over just yet. So I'm going to keep them in for another hour and see where they get, and if they get a little bit more dry, then I'll flip them over and then lightly salt the other side. Okay, so it has been another hour since I last checked on these. What I'm going to do is, since they are getting a little more wrinkled on the top, is I'm going to go ahead and take these out, flip them over, and then lightly salt them so that it can start to release some of the juices and start the drying process a little more. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take the fork and lightly flip these over. They are soft, but I wanted them to start to get a little bit of the wrinkling on the skin before I flip them. Okay, so I have flipped all of these over, and I'll just show you what they look like really quick. And now what I'm going to do is just take some of the salt, which is finely ground sea salt, and I'm going to, not liberally, but I'm going to take it and I'm just going to spread it up from up top. It does not need a whole bunch on it. We've already salted one side, and you have to watch when you're salting these, because you've already salted them once on one side and you're dehydrating them. So they're going to get smaller and condense, and you don't want it to end up being like a packed punch of salt. So it's very, very minimal salt, just enough to help release some of the liquid. And now we're going to go ahead and stick them back in the oven. Okay, again, I'm going to put the two smaller ones side by side on the bottom. And then the larger one on top. Now these, I'm going to start off with an hour and a half. And then after an hour and a half, we'll see where they're at, and then I'll probably do hour increments after that. Okay, so it is the next day. It actually took me the entire day to dry these. And what you want to make sure you do when you're drying them is, I think I had them in there for about 4 hours, and then they started reaching the point where they were like bendable like this, and but not dry. You don't want them completely dry. You want at least 80% of the moisture gone. You don't want them squishy. You want them to still have some give to them. The ones that were over dry, I just went ahead and I ate, because they're still flavorful, but when storing them for like sun-dried tomatoes for cooking and stuff like that, I prefer that they still be a little chewy, I guess is what I'm trying to describe. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually work on storing them, and I'm going to be storing them in these little glasses. And then I'm going to be adding some dried seasonings to the glass as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. Okay, I'm just going to evenly separate these into the containers. I'm going to fill these containers about halfway, and then I'm going to add some seasonings. And whenever you're doing the seasonings, if you put fresh seasonings in there, the sun-dried tomatoes won't store as long if you put fresh seasonings in. So you're going to want to, if you want them to store for a long time, I would recommend putting dry seasonings in. You get the same flavor, personally, I think, and then it'll last quite some time. At least I would say 5 to 6 months in the fridge. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to add a little bit of garlic powder to each. And you don't need a whole bunch, just a little bit. It's a nice sprinkle. After the garlic powder, I'm going to add a little bit of onion powder. Again, you don't need too much, just a little sprinkle. I know that looks like a lot in my hand, but I'm spreading it amongst 6 jars and getting it all over my oven too. Then I also like to add a little Italian seasoning. And this is really just going to flavor the oil that the tomatoes are going to be sitting in. And then if you want spicy sun-dried tomatoes, which I am going to make half of these spicy because I do have friends that enjoy spicy foods. I'm not big on spice. I'm going to add some of my cayenne pepper flakes. These were from my garden. So I'm just going to add a pinch in there on half of these. Okay. And then I'm going to fill the container the rest of the way with tomatoes. You can pack them in there too. I'm going to make sure that I have enough for all 6 of these jars before I pack them down and squish the rest in. More in there. Okay, now what I'm going to do is just fill these up with olive oil. I just use light tasting olive oil. You can use any type of olive oil that you want. I just prefer the light tasting kind. And you're just going to fill it all the way up to the top so that all of the tomatoes are immersed in olive oil. I might have to open up another container of olive oil. They say you should use the best kind of olive oil. I just say use whatever olive oil you want to use. You also don't have to store these in olive oil. You can store them as is dried. You wouldn't have to add any type of seasoning or anything to it, or at least I wouldn't if you were storing them dried. But since I'm storing these in olive oil, I wanted to add seasonings to flavor the oil that they're going to be in. I'm going to go ahead. I know that I didn't spill any olive oil on these tops. I'm going to go ahead and put the seal on here. And once I figure out which ones are the ones that have the red pepper flakes, I'll mark that as well. And then just putting the seal on, making sure that it's tight. Again, this is something that I'm going to be storing in the fridge. I would not store this outside of the fridge unless you were just keeping them dried. They probably wouldn't last as long outside of the fridge. I'm keeping them in the fridge specifically because it's going to increase the longevity of the sun-dried tomato. And I think you might sometimes with olive oil, it might start to solidify. I haven't had any issues with that just yet, but I know that I have seen other people indicate that if you store it in olive oil and then put it in the fridge, it might have a tendency to solidify. I haven't experienced that yet. Those are my sun-dried tomatoes in olive oil. And what I do is once I get the olive oil in there and the lid's on, I kind of give it a little shake to get all of the herbs mixed in. And then these will be good to go in the fridge and stay stored in the fridge for, I would say, probably 5 to 6 months. But I would say store them 5 to 6 months. The herbs are going to flavor the herbs and spices, I should say, are going to flavor the oil that the sun-dried tomatoes are in, and the sun-dried tomatoes will start to rehydrate from the olive oil. And then you can eat them as a snack. You can add them into dishes. So maybe one day I will show a dish with some of the sun-dried tomatoes. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you liked the content that I provided today, please be sure to hit like and subscribe. If you have any comments or want to see anything else or any suggestions for any type of preserving videos, be sure to leave that in the comment section below. Also, feel free to follow me on Instagram. You'll see daily updates on things that I'm doing for my garden and my everyday life. And until then, happy gardening!